Good afternoon, and welcome back to Never Is Now, ADL Signature Summit on Anti-Semitism and Hate. My name is Daniel Kelly, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for Technology and Society at ADL, and I am pleased to be the moderator for this panel, Lockdown, Login, the Power and Challenges of Online Social Spaces During COVID-19. And now I will take a minute to introduce our illustrious panelist speakers. Dr. Jessica Ashew is the Director of Policy for Reddit. In this capacity, she oversees all global government relations and public policy for the company, in addition to advising on matters of content, product, and advertising policy. Ashew comes to Reddit from a previous career in international affairs focused on the Middle East. From 2015 to 2017, she served as Deputy Director for former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley's Bipartisan Middle East Strategy Task Force at the Atlantic Council. Ashew holds a doctorate in international relations from Oxford St. Anthony's College, which she attended as a Marshall Scholar. She did her undergraduate studies at Brown University, including time abroad at American University of Beirut in Lebanon. She is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and was named one of San Francisco's Business Times 40 Under 40 for 2020. So welcome, Dr. Ashew. Our second panelist is Thank you. Our second panelist is Sean Lee, who is the head of Policy, Trust, and Safety at Discord, a global communication platform with more than 100 million active users. His teams are responsible for content moderation across the platform, and he works on public policy, platform policy, moderator outreach, and of course, fighting all manner of bad actors. He started the trust and safety team at Discord more than 3 years ago and has grown it to be almost 15% of the company. Before joining Discord, he also worked on trust and safety, privacy, and legal issues at Reddit and Dropbox. He holds a law degree from the University of San Francisco and a bachelor's degree from Rutgers University. So welcome, Sean.
Thank you.
Sure. And our third panelist here is Daiquiri Ryan, who is a Tehana and first-generation lawyer with a passion for social justice and technology. She is a new type of advocate, fusing her political and legal skills with digital-first movement building, authentic storytelling, and strategic collective action. In 2018, Daiquiri co-founded Neta Collab, a digital-first marketing and advocacy firm dedicated to advancing social justice causes and organizations. Through Neta, she helps shape social justice narratives in collaboration with clients making an impact in environmental justice, voting rights, civil rights, and tech accountability spaces. Daiquiri also serves as strategic legal advisor to the National Hispanic Media Coalition, a 35-year-old civil rights organization working to increase the representation of Latinx in Hollywood and to expand the digital rights of the Latinx community. Through this role, she is a subject matter expert in broadband access, net neutrality, platform accountability, media diversity, and other telecommunications and tech policy issues. She is a proud alumna of Arizona State University and the George Washington University School of Law. So thanks, Daiquiri, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And just a quick reminder to our audience, please don't forget to use the chat box feature to the right of the video to pose questions for the Q&A segment at the end of the session. Please type questions throughout the panel, and our Q&A moderator will select a few to ask the panelists after the initial discussion is complete. So I'll start just with a little bit of background around what we're talking about here, and then we'll turn to our panelists to ask some questions. So as of this morning, COVID-19 cases in the United States were at over 11 million total for the year. Yesterday, the U.S. passed the 250,000 mark for COVID-19 related deaths. Over 250,000 have died because of the coronavirus in the U.S. in 2020. COVID-19 cases remain on the rise across the U.S. and across the world. And as the world went into lockdown as a result of the coronavirus earlier this year, offices went remote, events went virtual, and countries around the world went into lockdown. As this happened, people around the world were leaning into various means of virtual communication and digital social platforms as the norm for connecting and communicating and collaborating in their daily lives. A Harris poll conducted in March and May found that between 46 and 51% of U.S. adults were using social media more since the outbreak began. In May, when their most recent poll was taken, 51% of respondents, 60% of those 18 to 34, 64% of those 35 to 49, and 34% of people 65 and up reported increased usage on certain social media platforms. This trend continues in online games, which are also forms of social platforms. Popular titles such as Call of Duty Warzone saw their player base almost double from 30 million in March to 75 million in August. NBA 2K, another popular franchise, saw an 82% year-on-year increase. A survey from the data analytics firm Newzoo saw that 2/3 of their respondents of a survey in March reported an increase in time spent playing games, and that the second most popular reason for that engagement in online games was for social interaction. Our ADL's online game survey, which was released yesterday, saw that over 80% of players, adults 18 to 45, experienced harassment in online games during COVID-19, while 68% experienced severe harassment, including stalking, physical threats, and discrimination based on identity. A social media survey, which we did earlier this year, found that 44% of American adults experience harassment on social media, with significant increases year on year in the perceived targeting of specific identities, such as the Muslim and Jewish communities, the Black or African American community, and the Hispanic Latinx community. ADL has been working on fighting hate on digital platforms since the 1980s, when we were investigating how extremists connected using electronic bulletin boards. In the 90s, we worked with AOL, and more recently, we're working with social media companies, such as the ones my esteemed colleagues here belong to, and online game platforms as well. All this is to say that the problems of hate and harassment have always existed in digital spaces, but as platforms grow in scale, as they have during COVID-19, these problems grow in scale in concert with the platform's willingness to take real steps to address hate and harassment on the platform and to ensure that their digital spaces are safe, respectful, and inclusive spaces for all people. So with all of that sort of in mind, I'll turn to my colleagues at the platforms to talk a little bit about their experience on their platform during COVID-19. Dr. Ashu, maybe you can start. What was sort of Reddit's experience with COVID-19, especially keeping in mind the experience of hate and harassment that you saw on the platform?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks once again for inviting me to this conversation. Before I get into kind of the specific details of how we responded to COVID-19, I think it's useful to take a quick high-level explanation of how Reddit works, because how Reddit's moderation and structure system works is quite different from some of the other social platforms. So it's best to think of Reddit as a community of communities. Reddit is a system of message boards, if you like, that are all based on topic, and they're all created by the users, and most uniquely, they are all moderated by the users. These are volunteers. They're not Reddit employees. They're just people who are passionate about a particular topic, and they want to have a conversation with other people who are passionate about that topic. So what we do is we empower those users to set their own rules that are appropriate to whatever particular space or topic they want to talk about. A super silly example that I like to use is we have a community called Cats Standing Up. And the only thing that you're allowed to post in Cats Standing Up is cats standing up on 2 legs, not 4 legs. If it's on 4 legs, it'll be removed by those moderators because they don't want to talk about cats on 4 legs. Furthermore, if you comment on those photos of cats standing on 2 legs, the only thing you're allowed to comment is the word cat, period. Anything else will be removed by an automated tool that we provide to all of our moderators to enforce the rules as they see fit. So while the cats example is very, very silly, it proves the point of the degree of autonomy that we give our moderators to set rules that are specific to what they want to talk about. And you can imagine how effective those rules are and those tools are when they're applied to situations and topics that are more serious, like racial issues, like addiction support communities and things of that nature. So given that at Reddit, we always put community first and we do everything in partnership with our user moderators, that really colored how we approached the response to COVID-19. Like other platforms, we experienced a large surge in usership. And so our first step was talking with the moderators of key communities where we saw increased usage to be sure that they were resourced appropriately to deal with that higher level of engagement, and also to be sure that they understood the tools that were available to them to keep their conversations safe and focused on the topic that they wanted to talk about. So COVID-19 definitely accelerated a lot of policy work that we had already been planning. And we did that in cooperation and consultation with our moderators. And then I think the other thing that's really important to talk about from a policy point of view as it applies to Reddit this year is the impact that the racial justice reckoning that the United States went through earlier this year had on us. So this was similarly kind of accelerating things that we already had planned, like COVID-19 did. And it accelerated those conversations that we were having with our moderators about what they wanted to see on the platform, what they wanted to see from in terms of changes to our rules. And so through that process of dialogue with our moderator community, with our user community, but also with trusted external groups like the ADL, we made some pretty significant updates to our content policy in the middle of this year, specifically to tackle hateful content in a more focused way than we had in the past.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Sean, do you want to talk a little bit about, and we'll get in, I think, a little bit after this, to more specifics around the updates that you integrated and the ways in which that impacted your users. But I'll turn to Sean, my colleague from Discord, at this point to talk a little bit about his experience and the platform's experience during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Sure, absolutely. And of course, thanks for the privilege really of being here. I think actually much as with Jessica, it's probably helpful to start with a brief overview, I think, of what Discord is. We are, a communications platform. We're actually set up kind of in a similar way where it is around servers. There's no sort of central space that everyone can broadcast to everyone on. It's much more a sort of space where people choose their communities. And so, individuals can create servers, and those servers can really be about anything. We have large servers dedicated, of course, around games, around music, around, the latest book from Brandon Sanderson, pretty much any interest group that you imagine, there is probably a server out there. And it is about that real-time communication between users around those interest groups. In terms of sort of how it's structured, the way that we sort of think about it is that it's a little bit like we are sort of Discord, right, as a whole is the federal government, if you will, right? We set a ground set of rules that everyone has to abide by. And then I think much as with Reddit, right, each moderator, each person in their server, each server owner can create their own rules sort of on top of that, right? Like each server is almost like a city or a county, or I guess the bigger ones are probably states, right? And they set their sort of rules on top. So that's Discord. In terms of COVID, so I think across the board, just a huge increase in both, I think, new users actually coming to the platform and, of course, in just usage overall. I think one of the things that is very much true, right, is that, for human beings, there is a fundamental need, a desire, right, for socialization, for knowing that you're not alone, for communicating with people, for talking to them. And I think what we saw is that as people weren't able to get that sort of like social need from, going outside and meeting people, that they increasingly took to internet platforms to get that. And so, yeah, just a gigantic, I think we saw over 50% year-over-year growth. And also, I think the other thing that was really interesting for us was that it was all over the world. So we had a huge increase in usage in Europe. We had a huge increase in actually usage from students, particularly in France. And so it was really interesting and, of course, challenging, I think, to deal with that growth. And then simultaneously, right, along with this huge increase in usage, as alluded to, the racial justice movement, the BLM movement, right, and that led to increased tensions. So, through the sort of course of the last 8 months, it has been just a tremendous, I think, increase in people using the platform, in the amount of time that they spent on the platform, in the ways that they were using the platform, and then, of course, the tensions that led to. So it's certainly been a challenge.
Thanks, Sean. And so I think it's a good way to transition a little bit to speak with Daiquiri from your perspective as an advocate, right? As someone who works on policy and advocacy related to civil rights and these platforms. Could you talk a little bit from your perspective how you feel like the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the kinds of communities that you serve and their experience in digital social spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me. And I'm very honored to be an advocate on this panel. And this is a great question. I think first and foremost, when we think about the COVID-19 pandemic and the hate and the targeting that first spiked, I think, at the height of the pandemic, right from the beginning, were attacks targeting the Asian American community. And of course, that was rooted from just the awful rhetoric that we were hearing from the White House. And so I think kind of in that same vein, we saw a rise in xenophobic and anti-immigrant rhetoric as well. And as far as kind of what stayed the same, we saw a spike in hate targeting the Latinx community, the community NHMC represents, but we really didn't need the pandemic to fuel that. It was already on the rise. And so actually, in fact, this week from the FBI, they released this Monday their new hate crimes data report. We're seeing that anti-Latinx hate crimes are at a 19-year high. And that includes the worst hate crime attack that the FBI has ever recorded in El Paso last year. And so that singular incident, motivated by white supremacy and what the El Paso shooter described as an obligation to stop the Mexican invasion, accounted for nearly half of the hate killings in all of 2019. So for us, to try to look at this and try to remember that the hate that each of these communities and other communities are facing online is really rooted in white supremacy. And so they're all connected. And from that white supremacist content and the flourishment that we're seeing on platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and new ones now like Parler, that's kind of where we see all of these targeted disinformation campaigns coming from. We see a very clear nexus between those two things. And those disinformation campaigns are working to silence our community and stifle our power. And it's really, like I said, it's all connected and really rooted in that same hateful place.
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying here, and I guess I think it's an interesting question to turn back to our platform partners here and to talk a little bit about. I think disinformation has been a topic that has been in the news and that a lot of folks are talking about. Could you talk a little bit about both how you addressed the issues of hate, harassment, white supremacy on your platforms, but also a little bit at a high level about how you think about and handle disinformation, both on Reddit and on Discord. Dr. Eshu, maybe you want to start there?
Sure, absolutely. So hate and harassment are not tolerated on Reddit. They're against our site-wide content policy. So similar to what Sean said earlier, Reddit is also kind of like a federal system wherein we do have a content policy that we set as the company and that we expect all of our subreddits to abide by. And if a subreddit or moderators are not abiding by that, we won't hesitate to action them, whether that means taking down a post, banning a user, or removing an entire subreddit in some cases. And as I mentioned earlier, this content policy is something that we're constantly evaluating to see how it's working in comparison to what users are actually experiencing on the site. And so this year, particularly around the middle part of this year, when the racial justice movement was accelerating in the United States, we had that dialogue with our users, and what they really wanted from us was more clarity in our site-wide content policy about hateful content explicitly. Because I will say, our thought process on this has been evolving in the past few years. And previously, we would get at hateful content through pre-existing policies against violence and against harassment. Because when you think about what hateful content actually is, 99% of the time it will fall into those two categories, and that's how we would get it. But the interesting thing was that when we spoke with our users, they really wanted more of a values assessment and a values statement in our content policy. And so that's why we made the change that we did earlier this year to explicitly state that hate based on vulnerability or identity is not allowed on Reddit. And we enforced that, banning several thousand subreddits in the process of that update. And in terms of misinformation, this is a very different issue that requires a different set of policy tools. And it was also something that we were thinking about this year, not only in the context of COVID, but in the context of things like the US election. And so disinformation, I would say, requires both an offensive and a defensive strategy. So in the offensive strategy, you really want to be equipping your users with good, high quality information so that they're inoculated against attempts at misinformation. And so on Reddit, the way that we did that was by sponsoring AMA series with experts on COVID, on public health, on vaccinations. We also did the same for the election. We were bringing in people like Naleo to speak specifically to, Latinx and Hispanic users on our platform about, how to vote, what are the rules around voting, what are the rules around identification, things of that nature. So, and we were kind of using banner announcements and things as well to make sure that there was a preponderance of easy to find, high quality information on Reddit. So that's the offensive strategy. And then, of course, the defensive strategy is making sure that if bad information appears, it doesn't appear for very long and kind of is quickly dealt with. And again, our moderator structure is our best line of defense against that. Our largest coronavirus community is actually moderated by virologists who are really into coronaviruses. And, this community actually existed before the COVID pandemic. And so they have rules in their community that ensure that you can only link to, for example, peer-reviewed scientific journals in their community. And that really helps cut down on misinformation. And the last thing we did on the defensive side was change our reporting structure so that it was easier for people to report misinformation explicitly to us so that we could investigate if there was anything coordinated happening on the platform and take action appropriately.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think the point you make about community and platform policies as a statement of values is a really important point, right? And that's something that we talk about at ADL repeatedly with platforms, right? It's not just the rules that govern your platform, but a statement to the public about what you value as a company and what are the values of your company. Sean, can you talk a little bit about the same thing from Discord's perspective, in terms of the ways in which you maybe approached it differently than Reddit is described?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think certainly we, and I would expect most internet platforms, are pretty aligned. Most human beings, maybe, right, are pretty aligned that, like, hate speech, harassment are bad, right, and they are bad for society, right, and they're certainly bad for communities. And so I think in a lot of ways, actually, it's pretty similar that we don't tolerate that. We take action, right, on users, on entire communities, right, when the case is that the community is the one that is sort of driving that or has a primary purpose of acting that manner. And to that point, one of the things that we do is that we will go out and search for these communities. We don't necessarily require that they be reported to us. We don't just wait reactively to say, oh yes, like someone has been hurt. We actually think that it's pretty important to go out and be like, cool, like what servers are out there, right? Like what are the communities that are out there, and are they good communities? Because I think to your point, Daniel, right, like we think that, right, like each one of those communities is on our platform. And we think that there is a responsibility to make sure that the platform as a whole, right, is one that is, I guess for lack of a better way of putting it, right, like does better, right? That it is welcoming to all individuals, that people feel that they can and have a place on the platform. Quickly on the misinformation and disinformation side, this is actually, I think, one of the areas where there is a little bit of a difference, in part because Discord is more sort of privately focused, right? You have to have an account, you have to be invited to a server. You can't sort of like drive by, browse content. We historically actually have had less of a problem with misinformation, period. It turns out that, right, like if you are a bad actor trying to spread misinformation, going to a platform where you can't go viral, where there are no upvotes, where you can't like a post, you can't reshare it, you can't whatever, means that it's not a very attractive platform to actually spread that misinformation. That being said, however, right, like that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And it was something where we actually spun up a task force during the early days of the COVID pandemic, right, up in February, March, April, to evaluate. And again, I think one of the similarities is that we also, our biggest coronavirus server that actually sprung up was also one that I think was actually cross-linked to the subreddit, if I remember correctly. And yes, had a whole bunch of medical staff on there. And they were very careful to say, okay, like, here's what's confirmed, here's what's not confirmed, right? Like to really give, I think, that context to that information, and to debunk rumors as they came up, right? To make sure that what they were spreading to the community of, I think it was probably 50 or maybe even 100,000 people in that server, that it was confirmed, right? And that it was like scientifically validated. I think on more recently on the election and election related stuff, right? Like I think that is something that we have also kept a very wary eye on, right? I think in the sense for us, right, even if we have not seen it to be a large problem in the past, I think one of the other responsibilities, right, of a platform is to make sure that we stay on top of these emerging trends. That just because it didn't happen, last year or 2 years ago or in 2016 doesn't mean that it's not going to happen now. And so we actually spent a lot of effort looking at the political servers that were up, looking at servers dedicated to political parties, political groups, and understanding what the information was that they were presenting, what the calls to action were, for example, whether there was any violence in there, right? And that's something that we've kept an eye on. Again, happy to say that I think for the most part, we don't have the same problems necessarily as some of those more public servers, which is not to say, sorry, those public services, but it is something that we're aware of, and it's something that actually we work across the industry to identify and try and stop.
Sure. Thank you. I guess, so we've talked a little bit at this point about the sort of great work that you all at the platforms have done to address either hate or harassment or misinformation. But Daiquiri, from your perspective, what do you feel like platforms like Reddit or Discord or others, what do you feel like they have missed during the COVID-19? What do you wish they would have done or wish they would do moving forward through the next phase of whatever the COVID-19 pandemic is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll start by saying not all platforms are created or designed equally, right? So I think, NHMC has worked in coalition with ADL and with a number of other organizations to advocate with platforms like Reddit, to try and find some sort of middle ground to voice our concerns and be able to move the needle. And we really commend, there's a lot of platforms that did great work during the pandemic, during this year, to really move that needle and make a difference when it comes to taking down and eliminating hate online. But that's definitely not the case for all platforms. Daniel, you know this in our work together in the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. We really are having a hard time with platforms like Facebook. They're more centralized and they're just showing that their content moderation practices are not as sophisticated as we need them to be in order to protect the dignity and the safety of our communities online. So it's been really hard to watch platforms like Facebook do a fairly decent job at taking down COVID-19 misinformation, but then turn a complete blind eye and leave up hate and harassment and conspiracy theory content, particularly, this summer around the death of George Floyd and the movement for Black Lives. And so we know we can do it. We've seen it in action. But they tend to selectively select who they favor or who they protect, and it really costs lives. And so that's something that we're struggling with, is this kind of false equivalency that we see at some of the platforms, where whether it's coming from the far right or wherever, that our lives, the lives of communities that are being targeted, are not taken as seriously as maybe the concerns of advertisers or groups that might be putting more resources into their presence on the platform. And so I think that's one of the biggest things, right? Is we want them to consistently and with more strength do their enforcement of their existing policies. And Sean, you brought up a really great point. I feel like we can talk about this in the context of the pandemic, but then there's like a subsection, right, of like an election during a pandemic. And so, for us, I know there's been some really great research that's already been done, but ahead of the election, our groups and a number of coalitions that we work with, including Change the Terms Coalition, called out to these platforms and said, hey, there's going to be a ton of misinformation. It's going to be targeting our communities that we really need to show up to the voting booth this election. And we didn't really get as much of a response as we wanted to. We did see some great work by Twitter and to an extent at Facebook to put labels on things that were incorrect. But we know that those labels alone don't work, right? They might help, but they don't stop the problem. And so that element of virality, right? If someone tweets something and they have a large following and 125,000 people have already seen it before you take it down, that's just not quite sufficient enough for us to be able to say we're protecting our democracy and our communities.
Sure. As you know, I totally agree with you in terms of the platforms you're talking about here. And I think one of the things we also talk about when we talk about the Facebooks and the Twitters is, and this may be a little wonky, but I think it's super important, is their transparency around hate and harassment, and our inability to understand, even at a high level, who is being targeted on any platform, how much are they being targeted, right? And I think if I can turn to Dr. Eshu, I think one of the things that Reddit did this year that was really commendable, right, was put out really the first transparency report that centered and reported data on who is being targeted on your platform, what communities are being targeted on your platform. I see that, I think ADL sees that as a real model for how transparency, something that we've been advocating for excuse me, something we've been advocating for many years, right? Which is platforms need to find ways to report on the experience of different communities and how they are experiencing hate and harassment on the platform, so that we can get at, there are many announcements that platforms make about changes they're making to their policy, to their product, right? But we can't actually know whether those things are having an impact unless we can measure the impact on the communities that are being targeted. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of hate report that you did and the decision to really share this important data and sort of how you landed there, and maybe a little bit at a high level on how you went about it. I think that would be really helpful to sort of highlight that work.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about that. We really pride ourselves on having a high level of transparency in the industry. We issue annually a very, very comprehensive transparency report about our rules, the enforcement of our rules, as well as law enforcement requests that we get. And we really make it a point to try to stretch ourselves to expand what we disclose every year and kind of flex that transparency muscle. And so we also believe very much in evidence-based policy making on Reddit, because you can have a policy solution that sounds great, but if the data is not backing it up and demonstrating it to be effective, then it may not be the solution that you want. So when we made this content policy update around hateful content earlier this year, it was very important to us to try and apply some research methodology to demonstrate whether it was effective, and also just to, for us, look into what's the actual size of the problem on the platform, because that would help us better focus our limited resources. And so what our data science did was try to size kind of the volume of hateful content on Reddit. And they had to do this in kind of an approximate way because it was the first time that we were attempting this. And so I think that our methodology is going to continue to evolve as we do further studies on this. But in a very crude way, they just kind of use some machine learning tools as well as some third-party resources and some on-platform resources like the auto-moderator rules that our moderators are using to prevent certain words, for example, from appearing in their community, to try and get an approximate estimate of just the volume of kind of hateful or probably hateful content on Reddit, because we all know that hateful content is very, very highly contextually relevant. And that's what makes it so hard to size using kind of a blunt machine learning tool, because people, I will say, are unfortunately very, very creative in the ways that they come up with to be mean to each other. And they know at this point that they probably can't just kind of throw around racial slurs because that will be picked up very, very quickly. And so the language evolves. And that's where our strength is in terms of having human moderators that see how the context of the conversation is changing and evolving within their communities so that they can pick up more of this coded language and we can work that into our models. So that being said, we found that about 0.2% of daily content on Reddit is potentially hateful. And then of that kind of size of kind of potentially hateful content, we wanted to see what the impact of our rule change was. So we looked at the size kind of before in the weeks leading up to the rule change and then the weeks immediately after the rule change. And we did find about an 18% reduction in that potentially hateful content after we made the rule change. So definitely something that is effective, moving in the right direction. And we're digging in to see how we can increase that number. But I will say, because of the methodology, it's probably not feasible for that to become a 100% reduction, because it's unlikely that 100% of that content is actually hateful because of the context issue that I mentioned previously. And then the last thing I'll say that was a part of this study was we wanted to look at who was being targeted by this content, because that's hugely important, again, to how we direct our resources and how we think about solutions to this. And so we found that about 50% of the potentially hateful content on Reddit was dealing with matters of racial or national identity. And then after that, there was actually quite a large drop-off. The next kind of most common attack vector or attack criteria was at 16% of the content. And it was based on something that we actually don't traditionally consider to be a protected category, which is political ideology or affiliation. And I think that that's a really interesting data point, because I think that it does say a lot about kind of the tone of where the political conversation is in the United States at the moment. So those were really, really interesting learnings for us, at least as an initial point of research. And we're looking forward to, continuing that work and learning more, sharing it with our community, and coming up with some innovative solutions based on that data.
Thank you for sharing that. No, I think that's such important work, and I'm glad to hear that it's going to continue. I guess I wanted to flag something that you said. You talked a little bit about machine learning and automation. And I guess for folks who are watching who have different levels of sort of familiarity with the ways in which social platforms operate, I think one of the things we're seeing in the COVID-19 pandemic is sort of an increase in among sort of the larger platforms, an increase in automated moderation, right? In terms of a reliance on technologies such as machine learning that would automatically scan a platform based on certain criteria and flag content to content moderators for review and for potential action by the platform. But Sean, something that we've talked about a little bit is that as you mentioned, Discord has seen 50% growth year on year, has seen expansion across the world, and you've expanded your team as a result of that. But you haven't actually taken the route that many platforms have taken in terms of relying more heavily on automation and you've actually focused your expansion on human content moderators and sort of expanding your team. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, just at a high level for folks, who may hear about, how these kinds of technologies work, why you went towards the route of sort of more human content moderators versus, relying more on these sort of high-tech automated solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think really what it comes down to is that is that the high-tech automated solutions are just not quite there. And I think actually that Dr. Su sort of mentions the why of it a little bit, right? Like it is about that contextual element that, right, like these are human beings who are talking to each other. And it turns out that human beings have a incredibly wide range of ways that they can communicate with each other, that they can insult each other, that they can, target each other, right? And that overall, a AI and ML model, I think the tech is getting there, right? But it's not quite good enough, I would say, in almost all cases to actually make fundamentally like good decisions and have a good understanding of what the conversation is actually about. Most AI ML models don't even go as far as to understand the context of a conversation at all. They're mostly focused on like one line, right? And I think like the problem that we see and the reason that we chose to really just massively expand our trust and safety team and hire human beings, right, to help deal with the volumes is because we wanted to make sure that when people are reporting these things, that they are seen by a human being, right? That they're seen by a human being who has some understanding of the context, that understands fundamentally what hate speech is, right? And not necessarily, that's not working on like, oh yes, well, this is a bad word, we should strike it, right? I think that there are basic tools that can address certainly some of it, right? Like racial slurs, sure. But I think that, again, as I think we've seen, as Reddit has seen, as I think the bigger platforms have seen as well, a lot of the stuff that you should be concerned about is stuff that is not necessarily going to be picked up by the automated systems, or there's additional context, right? That when someone uses a term, they may be using it in a negative way, in a derogatory way, or possibly as a member of that in-group, or as a, quotation of a song lyric, right? There's a whole bunch of ways that you can use this language. And I think not understanding that context leads to bad decisions, right? At the end of the day, every time someone reports in, they are saying, hey, I've been hurt. And I think our thought, right, is that there should be a human being, a trained expert human being who can use judgment and say, okay, is this person trying to hurt you? Was this a political discussion? Is this a discussion where actually people are saying, oh, insert term here is bad, right? We don't want a machine saying, oh yes, like this is a bad word, therefore you're going to get banned. We want a human being to look at it and say, oh, what was the intent here, right? What happened here? What was the intent here? What is the best solution for, frankly, for society? I think that in a lot of ways, the way that we look at it is like the role of trust and safety, the role of content moderation is in some sense more to act as judges than as janitors, right? It is not a matter of just like, oh yes, we're sweeping the bad stuff away. I think in a lot of cases, it's actually about like solving interpersonal issues, right? About making sure that people the sort of platform comes to the right decision about what it wants on its platform and about like what is bad behavior. And maybe sometime in the future, machines will do a better job of it. I don't think they do a very good job now. I will say, so I will caveat this, I think that there are some areas, again, that they may help in, for example, prioritizing reports. There are some areas where they may help in making our jobs easier, but I don't fundamentally believe that a world where like the machine is sort of the first and last say on whether content should come up or whether users should be banned is a good world.
Thank you. I think it's an interesting question as we at ADL are in more of the research space around this, right? And think about how we develop products to detect and to understand hate speech online. I think it's an important flag about how far the actual at a commercial level, at a platform level, how far a lot of this technology has to go. Daiquiri, I want to turn back to you. I think from the perspective, we haven't really talked a little bit about sort of the National Hispanic Media Coalition and the work you do with them, and your sort of mission to eliminate hate, discrimination, and racism towards the Latinx community. Can you talk a little bit about where you as an organization are focused, right? Especially in terms of digital platforms and social media and other forms of digital media, and where your sort of priorities are and what you're working on, and what you would want to hear from our partners from the platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I know you mentioned this at the introduction stage, but NHMC is a 35-year-old civil rights organization, and we were founded specifically to combat hate targeting the Latinx community. And so, back 35 years ago, that was over the airwaves on cable news and TV. But as organized hate has largely moved online, so too has our work. And so, in the last several years, we've really seen a movement of the emboldenment of people who have white supremacist views, and it's a little bit easier, right? You no longer have to stand in the public square and shout about how much you hate Latinx. You can just hide behind your keyboard, and dehumanize our community and others. And I think where we are starting to see this differently is that not only are some platforms often letting you do that, but they might even be using their algorithms to make it easier for you to find other hate-centered or like-minded groups, people, and events. And so that's kind of the frame of how we look at it. But for us, it's also about short-term and long-term. So we've been doing this for 35 years, right? We know that it's not going away, but the landscape has shifted. And so what we're really thinking about moving into next year and kind of this new phase for us is, what are the long-term harms of this? We know that our community has been targeted and will continue to be targeted. And what are the psychological effects of someone who's a young person who grew up just immersed in a digital world and has been bombarded with that hate their whole lives? And how can we shift the system to better serve that? So one thing I like to say and like to think about is, it's really hard to advocate for our community in a system and in a society that was not built for us to participate in the first place. And I think that's a really interesting point when we think about it in the tech accountability space. Or were these platforms even designed for our use? Were they designed for our communities to be able to have an equal voice? And so that's long term. Short term, there's a lot of absolutely necessary work that we have to do before we can get to that, right? Before we can achieve those like larger systematic changes. And a lot of that, has to be reactionary. A lot of civil rights groups, including NHMCs, we're a small team, and we work as hard as we can with all the resources we have to try and fight the platforms or bad actors, and just try to constantly be shifting on as to where hate is shifting already. And unfortunately, a lot of times when we're advocating for change, safety, and dignity for our community, to the platforms and their leadership, we end up being coddled or handled, and we never really get to the people who are doing the decision making. And we're just, like I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to continue to say, take me seriously over and over and over again. But I did want to highlight one piece that we actually are working on this week with our allies over at Free Press and Center for American Progress and a number of other civil rights and Latinx groups. We sent over a letter to Facebook to address what we're calling the Spanish language disinformation gap. And I want to caveat that with, Latinos are not all the same. We're not a monolith. Not all of us speak Spanish. But this is something that I think we can see a very clear nexus as to the targeting of our community. And so there are a number of posts that clearly have calls to violence, calls to arms, and contain false information about voting, the coronavirus, conspiracy theories that remain on Facebook, despite being flagged by our groups, by everyday users, and they're being left up simply because they're in Spanish. This is a major issue for us, and it shows that not only does Facebook and other platforms, because it's not unique to Facebook, not only do they have a problem enforcing against hate and information manipulation, just kind of as a blanket, what we're seeing, but they also likely just aren't culturally competent enough to enforce in other languages or in slang or in, community-based jargon type of situations. And so that's really disconcerting for us. And I think that ties into that larger theme of how do we make a systemic change that includes our voices at the decision-making table?
No, I think it's been such a pleasure getting to know your work and the work of NHMC more closely as we work more together this year. And I think it's such an important perspective that you're bringing to this conversation. And I guess to the point that you're making about Spanish language content, I think, and to Sean's and his earlier point about uh, platform policies as a statement of values. I think there was a study earlier this year or last year that showed that Facebook supports something like 110 languages, and about less than half of those their standards are translated into them, right? Which shows, I think, a certain level of prioritization, right, of their efforts. And so as we sort of move towards the end of our discussion here, I think there's some good news on the horizon about a potential vaccine, but we also, the cases keep rising, and I don't think our sort of digital first world is going to be changing that much anytime soon. So I guess I wonder if my panelists can speak to, either from the perspective of their platform or as advocates, where they feel like the challenges ahead are in our, the next wave of whatever our COVID-19 pandemic world is. Dr. Eshu, maybe if you want to start just thinking about, what is Reddit keeping track of and thinking about as we go into the end of this year, next year, and whatever's next for the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, for us, I think our focus is on evaluating the changes that we've made, because as mentioned, we made a lot of changes this year, and now we need to really study whether they're working, where we can tweak them, and where we can make things easier for our users. So as an example, a thing that we did a couple of weeks ago was we revamped our entire reporting flow. Because we were getting the message from users that it was confusing the way that they would report bad content. So we tried to make that simpler for them. Another thing that we're leaning into is having more structured conversations with our moderators that are organized around topical interests. So, if you're a moderator of a community that talks about racial issues, your concerns are quite different from a moderator of a community who talks about sports or gaming. And so we've been grouping these types of moderators into different moderator councils that we have video conversations with as a group, and not just kind of at middling levels of the company. This goes all the way up to and including our CEO is a part of some of these conversations, because it's really important that we're serving our moderators and we're serving the communities for whatever people want to come to Reddit for, whether it's something just kind of fun and frivolous, like talking about their favorite music, towards more serious issues like domestic abuse or any number of things that people struggle with.
Sure. No, those are all sort of critical issues, and I'm glad to hear that Reddit is engaging there and is expanding their processes. Sean, from your perspective, what is Discord going to be focused on in the coming months, or as we enter into next phase of the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that Daiquiri actually highlighted this issue really well, which is that I think especially, we're already a international platform, but I think as we grow to be a more international platform, I think the key to getting trust and safety right, the key to getting content moderation right, is to make sure that we are actually subject matter experts in whatever the harassment is, right? And I actually think it goes a little bit beyond just language. I actually think that, to your point, it's actually cultural context as well, right? Right, like I think a team of people in San Francisco are not going to make great decisions for people all over the entire world. And I think that one of the pretty major emphasis that we have in the next year is actually to do better and just to hopefully do a great job, right, of internationalizing and making sure that we have, people who are not just skilled in the language, but also in the culture of really, I think, any community that comes to Discord, right? If we're making decisions about, what speech is permissible in the Middle East, about what constitutes harassment there, I want to make sure that Discord has a good understanding actually of like what that looks like, right? If we're looking at something in Thai, like we should have native speakers of Thai that are like handling that content, not just like translating it and then hoping that we have the nuances correct. So I think internationalization as a sort of general facet is something that we're very concerned about, that we want to get ahead of, right? And then I think the other thing actually that sounds like Reddit and us are sort of what is this, convergent evolution, right? We're also doing a lot of focus on the moderators. We understand that the moderators are a heavy part of the ecosystem, right? And again, this is not true of every platform, but it's certainly true, I think, of our platforms. And one of the things that we're actually launching in the next month, and then we'll be working on through 2021, wow, it's been a year, is a moderator academy. And I think the idea there is that for a lot of people that are starting these communities, they don't know how to run a community, right? I don't think that there's either a course or anything where you can be like, oh yes, like I would like to start a community about an interest. That community might grow to be 500,000 people. What do I do? Right. And I think that that leads to a lot of pain somewhere down the line if you start a community of 100 people and then all of a sudden it's like 1,500 and you're like, oh my God, like what should I be moderating? How do I moderate? How do I make sure that this is a welcoming place? So one of the initiatives actually that we have set for the next year is to make sure that we do a better job of just like teaching our moderators, our server owners, like what running a community really means, right? What their responsibilities are, what we can do to help them. But I think that the hope, right, is to get to a point where anyone can say, oh, I would like to start a community about X, and then have a really like a guide, maybe even like a college curriculum, right? For them to be like, okay, well, here's things that you might see. Here's harassment. Here's hate speech. Here's how you might want to deal with it. Here's how you might want to moderate it. Here's things that you can report to us, right? And then I think it actually expands into some of those like more interpersonal, some of those socio-political issues, which is like, oh, at what point, like, how do you handle international people on your community? Right? Like, how do you handle differing viewpoints? Like, you know, stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff that we're looking to do with moderators because we think that that is also a fundamentally like super important part of the ecosystem.
Great, thank you. And I'm sure we'll be following up with you as you expand and roll that out to discuss ways in which we can be helpful as you put together that curriculum. And Daiquiri, from your perspective, and then at Collab and HMC, where do you feel like your energies will be focused in the next phase of what is to come here?
Yeah. So, for us, the fight's going to continue. It doesn't matter who's in the White House or, really any of those circumstances. White supremacy is not going to fall overnight. And so kind of on both of those fronts, we recognize that it's our job as civil rights advocates and, experts, subject matter experts in eliminating hate speech, especially online. We got to stay on our toes. We know that those bad actors are constantly trying to figure out how to game the system next. And so I think for us, we're not quite sure what's on the horizon, but we know that we're going to be ready to take it on.
Absolutely, and I know that we'll be at your side to help in whatever way we can in the fight that is to come. In our last few minutes, there is a question or two that has come into the chat. I think the first question that came in here was around political advertisements. So was this question around, the question is, should social platforms follow Twitter's decision to ban political advertisements, right? Daiquiri, I feel like that's more of a question for you. And then if we have a few minutes, maybe some questions from my platform colleagues about how they think about that on their platform.
Yeah, this is a great question. It's a really complicated issue.
Yeah.
In HMC, we don't have a public position, on whether it's good or bad to completely ban all political ads, because we know that they do have some value, right? And there are certain political ads that help our democracy. I think when we get into the area of disinformation and hate, then it's kind of blurred what should be allowed and what shouldn't. And just kind of on the topic, we're having a hard time on both fronts with the continued Facebook political ad ban, because on one side, right, it's definitely doing its job. We're seeing a reduction in some of these disinformation, hate type or campaigns that we expected, but we also are seeing that they casted a little too wide of a net. There are people who are doing get out the vote campaigns that couldn't get their ads up. There are just regular, social services, food banks, type of local organizations that no longer can advertise, and really with no end in sight for that ban and no transparency from the platform. So, I think it's a complicated issue, and I think it's going to continue to unfold over the next few years.
Sure. Sean or Dr. Eshu, did you have any thoughts on political advertisements from your platform's perspective?
Yeah, I can absolutely weigh on this because this is something that we thought a lot about this year and made some significant both policy and product changes in order to accommodate this conversation. I think Daiquiri really got it right when she said that there are some political ads that definitely add value to the conversation. We know that banning political ads across the board privileges incumbents and can make it harder for other candidates to break through. And so on Reddit, the way that we approached this is we wanted to allow political ads, but we wanted to allow them in a way that was fundamentally healthy for the conversation. And so what that meant for us is our political advertisements on Reddit are held to the same advertising policy standards as every other advertiser. We don't allow politicians to lie just because they're politicians. Secondly, targeting. So as a platform, we don't collect huge amounts of user data. And because we don't collect huge amounts of user data, we don't facilitate micro-targeting. And so it's important to us that there be that type of transparency in messaging on political advertisements. So you can't kind of send suppressive messages to one community and have no one else know about it. Third, we wanted to ensure that political advertisements started a conversation and weren't just kind of one-way broadcasting to people, because Reddit is all about conversation. We want to be the home to authentic conversation online. And so what we did was that we ensured that when there's a political ad on Reddit, in the comments underneath, what you see on every political ad is a link to every place across Reddit where people are talking about that advertisement. So you can see how a political advertisement is being discussed in our conservative community. You can see how it's being discussed in our Bernie Sanders community. You can see how it's being discussed in women's communities. And so we wanted to kind of facilitate the breaking down of those silos so that people can better kind of join the conversation, understand different people's points of view. And then lastly, transparency is really important to us. And so we instituted a transparency library for all political ads on Reddit that actually goes very far, amongst the farthest in the industry, in that it not only shows the ads and who was buying it, but shows what their spend was. It shows who they were targeting. It shows where that was placed on Reddit.
Sure. We just have a few seconds here. So I want to say thank you to my panelists for joining for this important conversation and for the work they do on their platforms and for the community. And also to say that today is the last day of our Never Is Now event, and that we are culminating with a closing session tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. We hope that you will join us, and you can always watch sessions that already happened here on the same site. Thanks to everyone for being a part of Never Is Now.